Ever get that feeling? Like, someone's watching everything you say online, or maybe you've held back on a comment, worried about how it might look, what people might think.
Yeah, it's kind of unsettling when you think about it too much.
Exactly. And that's what we're tackling today. That blurry line between, well, protecting people and uh, straight up controlling what they see and hear. We're doing a deep dive into government overreach and censorship,
Yeah.
basically. Can labeling something disinformation be a tool to, like, silence dissent?
Big questions. And we've got some really thought-provoking material to dig into.
We do. To help us unpack all of this, we've got an expert with us, someone who can help make sense of it all.
Happy to be here. Always up for a good deep dive.
Perfect. So we're looking at two contrasting pieces today. First up, an article by John and Nisha Whitehead. They're waving a big red flag about what they call the nanny state.
Yeah, basically the idea that the government's becoming this overbearing force, like treating citizens like children, unable to think for themselves.
Right. And their argument is,
They're saying governments use crises to, expand their control and shut down anyone who disagrees. They even compare it to stuff like the war on terror, the war on drugs, even how governments responded to COVID.
interesting. So these moments of crisis become an excuse to grab power, and then those powers never really go away.
That's the gist of it. And they use Hillary Clinton's call for greater control of the internet as like a prime example of this. They're worried that by just slapping the label disinformation on anything they don't like, governments can target whoever they want.
And ramp up surveillance, all under the guise of, protecting us.
Exactly, which, let's be honest, is a bit ironic. Claiming to protect freedom by limiting what people can say.
Yeah, it reminds me of that whole who watches the watchman thing. If it's the government deciding what's true, then who's keeping them in check?
That's the core question the Whiteheads are raising. They even use the image of a gulag, those forced labor camps from the Soviet Union, to show where this could all lead. Their point is, this isn't just some abstract threat, This level of control has happened before.
Wow. Yeah, that's a pretty heavy comparison. Makes you think twice about dismissing those slippery slope arguments.
Oh, right. But we do have a counterpoint here. Enrique Aurelli actually has some pretty strong words for the Whiteheads' take on all of this.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, he calls their narrative incomplete and maybe even a little manipulative. He says they're so focused on Soviet-era history that they're missing similar examples happening right now and, much closer to home.
Like, what kind of examples are we talking about?
Well, he brings up Guantánamo Bay, the U.S. and NATO's interventions around the world, even some Israeli policies. He's basically saying the Whiteheads are picking and choosing history to fit their narrative.
Ah, so he's saying it's not just governments we need to be worried about.
Exactly. Aureli argues that corporations and those elite groups, they play a huge role in controlling information too.
So it's big brother and big business we need to keep an eye on.
Right. And Aureli says this laser focus on government overreach, it might actually be a distraction from how power really works. Like, the Whiteheads have this very idealized view of free speech, as if having the right to say something is enough.
But that's not how it works in the real world.
Not at all. You need access, right, to those channels, to a platform, to an audience. And if those channels are controlled by, say, corporations, well, that changes things.
Right.
And the internet, even with all its problems, it's the one place where a lot of this critique of power is happening, right?
It's true. If you want to challenge those in power, you need a way to reach people. But then, who controls a lot of those platforms? Corporations. It's kind of a messed up cycle.
It is. And here's the interesting thing. Both the Whiteheads and Aureli, they point to some of the same tactics being used to silence dissent, but they don't agree on who's actually using them.
Oh, I see. So they both see the problem, they just see it coming from different places.
Exactly. And one of these tactics, it's a little disturbing, honestly. They both talk about this trend of using mental health as a way to, discredit people.
Oh, yeah. The Whiteheads had that example from New York City. The idea that you could actually be hospitalized if your beliefs are considered dangerous, that was pretty chilling.
Right. And Aureli takes it a step further. He says this is part of a bigger pattern of basically saying, if you don't agree with the mainstream, you must be mentally unstable.
So it's a way to dismiss people without actually, dealing with their ideas. If you could just label someone as crazy, you don't have to listen.
Exactly. And it's not just about mental health. They both talk about surveillance, too. Think about it. All that technology that was supposed to be for security or public health, during COVID.
Like the contact tracing apps.
Exactly. Are those tools being used in ways we didn't even think about?
It's a good question. And it kind of reminds me of those red flag laws and the pre-crime stuff that's popping up. Basically, using data to predict who might commit a crime in the future.
And that brings up all these issues about due process, right? Innocent until proven guilty. Are we really okay with a system that labels people as potential criminals based on, like, algorithms? Or their internet history?
It sounds like something out of Minority Report, arresting people for crimes they haven't even committed.
Right, and the Whiteheads are particularly worried about how these programs could be used against people based on their political views.
Which goes back to their whole point about freedom being chipped away,
Yeah.
little by little. They're saying, we're constantly being told to give up liberties for safety. But how much of that safety is real?
And this is probably where Aurelli would jump in and say, that narrative, that fear, it's often used by those in power, right? And not just governments. Corporations benefit from it too.
Because if we're afraid, we're more likely to accept things we wouldn't otherwise, more likely to give up those freedoms.
Exactly. So it always comes back to control. Who controls the story? Who controls the information? And that brings us right back to this really loaded word, disinformation.
It feels like everyone's throwing that word around these days. But like we've been talking about, it's not always so clear who gets to decide what counts as disinformation.
And that's exactly Aureli's point. He's saying just focusing on disinformation, it's like letting those bigger power structures off the hook. It lets us ignore the whole system that benefits from controlling what we see and hear.
So it's not about whether something's true or false, but about who benefits from, like, keeping that information quiet.
Exactly. And who ends up getting silenced because of it. Aureli points to some real-world examples, like when governments crack down on protests or try to silence whistleblowers.
Right, because those in power, they're the ones who often get to decide what's true and what's disinformation. Right?
Exactly. They justify it in the name of security or fighting disinformation. But really, it's about shutting down anyone who disagrees and protecting their own interests.
It's easy to get lost in the details. But this is about way more than just, like, fake news online. This is about freedom, about who gets to define what's real, and what happens when people abuse that power.
And both the Whiteheads and Aureli, even though they come at it from different angles, they're both saying, be critical. Don't just accept the narratives you're being fed. Information is never neutral.
Right. There's always something else going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. It's about power dynamics, money, all these different forces at play.
So if we can't depend on governments or corporations to protect free speech, what can we do? It feels kind of overwhelming.
It is a huge issue, but it starts with being aware. Question everything. Look for different perspectives, especially the ones that make you uncomfortable.
Because those are often the ideas that need to be discussed the most, right?
Exactly. Sometimes the most dangerous ideas are the ones we're not allowed to even talk about.
That's a powerful thought. And a good place to wrap up, I think. This has been a lot to take in, but it's definitely given us a lot to think about.
It's a conversation that we all need to be having and keep having.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this question. In a world where information is so tightly controlled, how do we figure out what's true? And just as important, who can we trust? Until next time, keep asking those questions.